The wind that tore through the settlement of Iron Ridge didn't just chill the skin, it hunted for the bone. It was a living thing, a biting, unseen beast that rattled the loose boards of the boardwalk and stripped the last clinging dead leaves from the scrub oaks. Lynn stood on the edge of the thoroughfare, her beige prairie dress snapping violently around her ankles. The fabric was too thin for this latitude, a cotton weave meant for the humid valleys of the south, not this high country purgatory where the air tasted of frost and wood smoke. She pulled her woolen shawl tighter, though the moth-eaten yarn offered little defense against the gale. Her knuckles were raw, chapped red and splitting at the webbing, a testament to 3 weeks of sleeping in a lean-to behind the livery stable. She had arrived with the last wagon train before the pass snowed in, and every door she had knocked on since had remained firmly shut. Iron Ridge was not a place of charity. It was a collection of rough-hewn timber and desperate ambition, populated by miners who spent their copper on whiskey and women who had no use for a stranger with nothing to trade but her own 2 hands. Lynn had tried the laundry, where the steam turned the air thick and grey, but the matron had looked at her slight frame and shook her head without a word. She had tried the scullery of the Grand Hotel, where the smell of roasting venison made her stomach cramp with a hunger so sharp it felt like a knife wound. The chef had merely pointed a greasy ladle toward the back alley, his eyes sliding over her with a mixture of indifference and disdain. Survival here was a closed loop, and she was on the outside, watching the light fade from the sky as the temperature plummeted. She walked now with the methodical slowness of someone conserving energy. Every step was a calculation. If she moved too fast, the dizziness would take her; if she stopped, the cold would settle into her marrow. The town was shutting down for the night, lanterns flickering to life behind frosted glass panes. To the locals, the coming winter was a hardship to be endured with stock pantries and stacked firewood. To Lynn, it was a sentence. She paused before the general store, the golden light spilling out onto the frozen mud of the street. Inside, she could see jars of pickled eggs, sacks of flour, and the heavy warmth of a pot-belly stove. It looked like a different world, separated from her by a single pane of glass and 1,000 miles of prejudice. She didn't want pity. She didn't want a handout. She wanted a wage. She wanted the dignity of exhaustion that came from work, not the hollow fatigue of starvation. She took a breath, the air stinging her lungs, and pushed the door open. The bell above the frame jingled, a cheerful sound that felt entirely out of place with the dread sitting heavy in her chest. The warmth hit her first, a physical wall of heat that made her skin prickle and her eyes water. The general store smelled of coffee beans, sawdust, and cured leather. It was the smell of civilization, of safety. The proprietor, a balding man with a stained apron and eyes that had seen too much bad credit, looked up from his ledger. His expression hardened the moment he saw her. He didn't need to speak, the set of his jaw said it all. She was the drifter, the woman who had been asking for work in a town that had none to give. Lynn kept her chin level, refusing to let her shoulders slump. She walked to the counter, her boots making no sound on the floorboards. She had to try. Just one more time. If this failed, the night outside would be long, and she wasn't sure she would wake when the sun rose. She placed her hands on the counter, palms flat, trying to stop them from trembling. "I can sweep," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. "I can stack the inventory. I can scrub the floors until the wood shines like new." The proprietor sighed, closing his ledger with a heavy thump that echoed in the quiet room. "I told you yesterday," he said, his voice flat, devoid of malice but utterly lacking in compassion. "I got a boy for the heavy lifting and my wife handles the books. I got no wages for you. Not now. Not next week." Lynn stood frozen, the rejection settling over her like a heavy shroud. It wasn't the words that hurt, she had heard them a dozen times in as many days, it was the finality of it. The proprietor turned his back, returning his attention to a shelf of canned peaches, dismissing her existence with the casual ease of a man who slept in a feather bed. She felt the shame rise in her throat, hot and acrid. She turned to leave, her hand reaching for the door latch, her mind already bracing for the assault of the wind outside. That was when the voice stopped her. It came from the back of the store, from the shadowed corner where the light of the oil lamps didn't quite reach. It was a deep voice, rough like gravel grinding under a wagon wheel, quiet but carrying a weight that made the air in the room seem to still. "Hold on." Lynn paused, her hand hovering over the iron latch. She turned slowly. A man was sitting on a crate near the stove, a cup of coffee steaming in his hand. She hadn't noticed him when she entered. He had a way of blending into the stillness, like an old piece of furniture that had always been there. He was older, perhaps in his 40s, with a face that looked like it had been carved out of granite and left to weather in the sun. His beard was shot through with grey, and his hat was pulled low, casting a shadow over his eyes. He wore a long duster coat, the leather cracked and worn, and a gun belt hung low on his hips, the holster tied down with a rawhide thong. He wasn't a miner. He wasn't a shopkeeper. He looked like the land itself, unforgiving and enduring. The proprietor looked nervous, shifting his weight. "Mr. Holt," he stammered. "She's just leaving." "I was just telling her." The man named Holt raised a hand, silencing him. He stood up, and the room seemed to shrink. He was tall, with broad shoulders that filled out the heavy coat. He walked toward Lynn, his spurs chiming softly against the floorboards. He didn't walk with a swagger, but with a deliberate, economized gait. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough that she could smell the scent of tobacco and horse sweat clinging to him. He looked down at her, his eyes dark and unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. He studied her face, taking in the hollows of her cheeks, the cracked lips, the defiant set of her jaw. He looked at her hands, red and raw, and then at the thin beige dress that offered no protection against the killing frost. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask where she came from or why she was alone. Those were questions for polite society, and looking at him, Lynn knew he had no use for such things. He simply looked at her with a gaze that stripped away the pretense and saw the survival instinct burning beneath. "I have a cabin," he said. The words were slow, spacing themselves out. 30 miles north. Up in the timberline he paused, letting the distance sink in. "It's a hard place. Winters are long. The snow drifts high enough to bury a horse." Lynn met his gaze, refusing to look away. She was trembling, but not from fear of him. She was trembling because the hope was more terrifying than the despair. He continued, his voice lowering. "I need someone to keep the place. Keep the fire fed. Keep the stew hot. I'm gone days at a time tracking or hunting. It gets quiet up there. Quiet enough to drive a person mad if they ain't got the stomach for it." He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing slightly. Then he asked the question. It wasn't about her skills. It wasn't about her past. "You know how to stand your ground when the wolves howl?" The question hung in the air, heavier than the smoke from the stove. It wasn't a metaphor. In this country, the wolves were real and they were hungry, but Lynn knew he was asking something else, too. He was asking if she was breakable. He was asking if the silence and the isolation would shatter her mind before the cold shattered her body. She thought of the nights behind the livery stable, listening to the drunken shouts of the miners, the wind screaming like a banshee, the gnawing emptiness in her belly. She thought of the long journey across the ocean, the loss, the constant movement, the refusal of the world to let her rest. She had been surviving the wolves, two-legged and four-legged, her entire life. "I don't run," Lynn said. Her voice was quiet, scarcely a whisper, but it didn't waver. "And I don't scare easy." Holt held her gaze for a long moment, searching for a lie. He didn't find one. He gave a single, curt nod, as if confirming the structural integrity of a fence post. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver dollar, flipping it onto the counter. It spun on its edge before rattling to a stop. "For provisions," he said to the shopkeeper, not looking back. "Pack her a sack. Beans, coffee, flour. And get her a coat. Put it on my tab." He turned back to Lynn. "Wagon leaves at first light. Be at the stables. Don't make me wait with that." He turned and walked out into the night, the bell jingling cheerfully behind him, leaving Lynn standing in the warmth, the impossible weight of a future suddenly placed in her hands. The next morning, the world was a canvas of white and grey. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy with the promise of more snow. Lynn was at the stables before the sun had even thought about cresting the horizon. She wore the coat the shopkeeper had grudgingly given her, a heavy wool thing, 3 sizes too big, smelling of mothballs, but it was the warmest thing she had ever owned. She climbed onto the bench of the buckboard wagon, her meager belongings tied in a bundle at her feet. Holt was already there, checking the harness of the 2 massive draft horses. They were dark beasts, their breath pluming in the frigid air like steam engines. He acknowledged her presence with a tip of his head, nothing more. No pleasantries. No good morning, just the work. They rode in silence. The town of Iron Ridge faded behind them, swallowed by the morning mist, and soon there was nothing but the vast, indifferent landscape. The trail wound upward, climbing into the foothills where the pines grew thick and dark. The wind here was different, it didn't just blow, it roared through the canyons, a constant, low-frequency rumble that vibrated in the wood of the wagon. Lynn watched the land change. The scrub brush gave way to towering firs, their branches heavy with snow. The air grew thinner, sharper. For hours, the only sounds were the creak of the leather harness, the rhythmic thud of hooves, and the grinding of the wagon wheels over frozen ruts. Holt drove with an easy competence, his hands loose on the reins, his eyes scanning the ridgeline. He seemed part of the wagon, part of the storm that was gathering above them. Lynn sat straight, clutching the bench, watching the world turn white. She realized then that she had left civilization behind entirely. There was no law out here but the weather and the man sitting next to her. They arrived as the light was failing, the sun dipping behind the peaks and casting long, blue shadows across the snow. The homestead was nestled in a small valley, protected on 3 sides by sheer granite cliffs. It was desolate. The cabin was a low, squat structure of peeled logs, dark with age and weather. A thin wisp of smoke curled from the stone chimney, suggesting a fire that had long since burned down to embers. There was a barn, its roof sagging slightly under the weight of the winter snow, and a corral where the fence rails looked grey and brittle. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a fortress built against nature, a place where survival was a daily negotiation. Holt brought the wagon to a halt near the cabin door. "We're here," he said, his voice startling her after hours of silence. He jumped down, his boots crunching in the knee-deep snow, and began unhitching the horses. Lynn climbed down, her legs stiff and aching from the cold. She stood for a moment, looking at the cabin. The wind howled through the valley, a mournful sound that seemed to echo off the canyon walls. There were no neighbors. No lights in the distance. Just the dark trees and the rising moon. She grabbed her bundle and the sack of provisions, her breath catching in her throat. This was it. The edge of the world. She pushed open the heavy wooden door of the cabin and stepped inside. The air within was stale, cold, and smelled of old grease, unwashed wool, and wood ash. It was dark, the only light coming from the dying embers in the hearth. As her eyes adjusted, she saw the chaos. It wasn't just messy, it was the neglected squalor of a man who lived only to sleep and eat, with no care for the space in between. Dirty tin plates were stacked precariously on a rough-hewn table. Clothes were piled in corners. Dust lay thick on every surface, grey and fuzzy like mold. The floor was littered with dried mud and wood chips. It was a dismal sight, a cave more than a house. Lynn stood in the doorway, the sack of flour heavy in her arms. She felt a moment of overwhelming panic. This wasn't a job, it was an excavation. But then she looked at the stove. It was a sturdy cast-iron beast, cold now, but capable of warmth. She looked at the walls, thick logs chinked with moss and mud. It was solid. It was shelter. She heard the heavy tread of Holt's boots on the porch, the stomping of snow. He entered, carrying a saddle over one shoulder, bringing the smell of the cold in with him. He dropped the saddle near the door and looked at her, then at the mess. He didn't apologize. He didn't look embarrassed. He just looked tired. "Wood's round back," he said, gesturing vaguely. "Spring is froze over, have to melt snow for water." He walked past her to the hearth, kneeling to stir the coals. Lynn set her bundle down on the only clear spot on the table. She didn't take off her coat. She looked at the grime, at the formidable task ahead, and felt a strange, cold resolve settle in her gut. She wasn't a guest here. She was the order to his chaos. The first 3 days were a war of attrition against the grime. Lynn worked with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. She scrubbed the floorboards with boiling water and lye soap until her hands were raw and the wood bleached pale. She scoured the tin plates with sand to remove the layers of grease. She beat the dust out of the moth-eaten rugs until the air in the valley was filled with a grey haze. Holt watched her with a guarded curiosity, saying little. He would leave at dawn, checking his traps or mending the fence lines, and return at dusk, exhausted and silent. He never commented on the changes in the cabin, but she noticed the way he lingered near the stove a little longer, or the way he paused before sitting at the now-clean table. The silence between them was thick, but it wasn't hostile. It was the silence of two animals sharing a den, wary but acknowledging the utility of the other. The work was brutal. Hauling buckets of snow to melt on the stove took hours. Chopping kindling for the stove until her shoulders burned. The wind never stopped, rattling the door on its hinges, testing every crack in the chinking. Lynn wore the beige dress under the oversized wool coat, her movements hindered by the layers but necessary for survival. She found a rhythm in the hardship. Wake before dawn. Stoke the fire. Melt the snow. Cook the porridge. Clean. Mend. Cook the beans. Sleep. On the fourth evening, a blizzard struck. It came screaming down from the peaks, blinding white and furious. The cabin groaned under the assault. Holt had come in early, his beard crusted with ice, his eyes rimmed with red. He sat by the fire, shivering uncontrollably, the cold having seeped deep into his core. Lynn saw the tremors in his hands as he tried to unbuckle his spurs. Without a word, she moved. She knelt before him, her small hands brushing his aside. She worked the leather straps, her fingers nimble despite the cold. She pulled the heavy boots off his feet, then the frozen socks. She didn't look at his face. She poured a mug of coffee, black and bitter, and pressed it into his hands. He took it, the ceramic clicking against his teeth as he drank. The warmth began to return to him, the shivering subsiding into a steady exhaustion. He looked at her then, really looked at her, over the rim of the cup. The cabin was warm. The floor was swept. The smell of stew, thick with sage and salt pork, filled the air, chasing away the scent of neglect. "Stew's ready," she said simply, standing up and smoothing her apron. She turned back to the stove to ladle out the bowls. "It's good," Holt said. The words were quiet, almost lost in the roar of the wind outside. It was the first time he had spoken about anything other than the work. It wasn't a compliment, exactly, it was an acknowledgement. A validation. Lynn paused, the ladle hovering over the pot. She didn't smile, smiles were scarce currency up here, but her shoulders relaxed, just a fraction. "Eat," she said. Before it goes cold they ate in silence, the storm raging against the walls, but inside, for the first time, the air felt settled. The beige dress was stained with soot, and her hands were rougher than they had ever been, but as she sat across from the gunslinger, listening to the fire pop and hiss, Lynn realized she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was building something. The deep winter settled in like a siege. The snow piled up past the window sills, turning the cabin into a dim, twilight world even at noon. The wolves Holt had warned about finally came down from the high ridges, driven by the same hunger that stripped the bark from the trees. It started with the horses. In the dead of night, a sound cut through the heavy silence of the cabin, a high, panicked whinny that shattered the peace of the dark. Holt was out of his bunk before the echo died, grabbing the Winchester leaning against the wall. He didn't say a word, didn't check to see if Lynn was awake. He just shoved his feet into his boots and threw open the door, the wind instantly extinguishing the embers in the hearth. Lynn lay there for a heartbeat, the cold rushing in, her heart hammering against her ribs. Fear told her to stay under the quilts, to pull them over her head and wait for the silence to return. But the memory of the question in the general store rose up, "Can you stand your ground?" She threw the covers off. Outside, the world was a chaotic swirl of shadow and moonlight. The corral was a frenzy of motion. The two draft horses were rearing, their hooves striking the rails, eyes rolling white in the darkness. Circling them were shapes, 5, maybe 6, low to the ground, moving with fluid, predatory grace. They were timber wolves, massive and gaunt, snapping at the horses' hocks, testing the perimeter. Holt was shouting, a guttural roar meant to intimidate, raising the rifle to his shoulder. The crack of the shot was deafening, a flash of orange fire that briefly illuminated the scene. One wolf yelped and spun away, but the pack didn't scatter. They were desperate. They smelled blood. Holt worked the lever of the rifle, the metallic clack-clack distinct in the cold air, but the mechanism jammed, the brass casing catching in the breech. He cursed, fumbling with the action, his fingers stiff with cold. A large male wolf, emboldened by the pause, lunged for the fence, scrabbling over the top rail toward the panicked geldings. Lynn didn't think. She didn't calculate. She saw the torch she had lit from the stove, a heavy branch wrapped in pitch-soaked rags used for lighting the path to the outhouse. She grabbed it, the flame sputtering in the wind, and ran out into the snow. She didn't have a gun. She had fire. She screamed, not a scream of terror, but a sharp, piercing cry of aggression she had learned from the street dogs in the port cities. She charged the fence, swinging the torch in a wide, violent arc. The fire roared, trailing sparks like a comet. The wolf on the rail recoiled, the heat singing its fur, and fell back into the snow. Lynn stood beside Holt, who was still fighting the jammed rifle. She didn't retreat. She thrust the torch at the circling pack, the flames casting wild, dancing shadows against the trees. "Get back," she yelled, her voice raw. The sudden aggression, the fire, and the human voice confused the pack. They were predators of opportunity, not combatants. With a final, snarling snap, the alpha turned and melted back into the tree line, the others following like smoke. Silence rushed back into the valley, heavy and ringing. Holt finally cleared the jam, snapping the lever shut, but the targets were gone. He looked at the empty tree line, then slowly turned to look at Lynn. She was standing in the snow in her nightdress and boots, the torch trembling in her hand, her breath coming in white clouds. He didn't say good job, he didn't smile. He just lowered the rifle. "Check the horses," he said. But the way he said it, soft, devoid of command, told her everything. She wasn't baggage anymore. She was part of the pack. February brought a cold so profound it felt like the atmosphere itself had crystallized. The metal of the stove handle would burn skin if touched without a rag. The work didn't stop, but it slowed, the days shrinking into short bursts of necessary exertion followed by long hours of endurance. It was during one of these brutal freezes that the accident happened. Holt had gone to the barn to chop ice from the water trough. Lynn was inside, kneading dough for biscuits, the rhythmic thump-turn-thump on the table providing a heartbeat to the room. She heard a dull thud from the barn, followed by a sharp intake of breath, and then nothing. No cursing. No footsteps. Just the wind whistling through the eaves. She wiped the flour from her hands and waited 10 seconds. Then 20. The silence stretched too thin. She grabbed her coat and ran out. She found him on the barn floor, one leg twisted at an unnatural angle beneath him, his face specifically gray in the dim light. The heavy iron pry bar lay next to him, he had slipped on the muck, and the leverage had thrown him hard. Getting him back to the cabin was a trial that tested every ounce of strength Lynn possessed. Holt was a big man, dense with muscle, and he was barely conscious, the pain sending him into shock. She couldn't carry him. She had to become a machine of leverage and physics. She dragged him through the snow, inch by agonizing inch, her boots slipping, her lungs burning with the frosted air. She didn't speak to him, didn't offer empty comforts. She grunted with the effort, her jaw set so hard her teeth ached. When she finally got him inside and heaved him onto the low bunk near the stove, she collapsed for a moment, gasping, before forcing herself up. The leg wasn't broken, she decided after probing the swollen joint with gentle, flour-dusted fingers, but the knee was bad. A tear. A sprain. He wouldn't be walking on it for weeks. For the first time, the dynamic inverted. The gunslinger, the provider, was grounded, reduced to a grimacing observer in his own home. Lynn took over everything. She chopped the wood, the axe feeling heavy and awkward in her hands until she learned to let the weight of the head do the work. She fed the horses, navigating around their massive hooves with a new confidence born of necessity. Inside the cabin, she brewed willow bark tea for his pain, forcing the bitter liquid on him when he tried to refuse. She changed the hot compresses on his knee every hour, wringing out the steaming cloths with blistered hands. Holt watched her from the bunk, his eyes tracking her movement. He saw the way she didn't complain, the way she ate only after he had been fed, the way she sat by the fire at night mending his torn duster with neat, tiny stitches. The shame of his helplessness hung over him like a cloud, but beneath it was something else, a profound, quiet respect. One evening, as she handed him a plate of beans and cornbread, he caught her wrist. His grip was weak, but his eyes were clear. "You're doing good, Lynn," he rasped. It was the first time he had used her name. She paused, looking down at his rough hand on her arm, then nodded once, pulling away to pour the coffee. It was enough. The thaw didn't arrive all at once, it came in whispers. The icicles clinging to the eaves began to drip, a slow, rhythmic ticking that sounded like a clock restarting. Patches of dark, wet earth began to appear through the snow like bruises healing. The air lost its bite, smelling of wet pine needles and mud. With the coming of spring, the claustrophobia of the winter lifted, replaced by a tentative peace. Holt was up and moving again, though with a limp that required him to lean on a polished hickory stick. The urgency of survival faded, leaving room for something softer to grow in the space between them. They sat on the porch in the evenings now, watching the sun dip behind the peaks, the sky turning a bruised peach color. They didn't talk much, but the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with a shared history of the winter. One evening, Lynn sat on the steps, peeling potatoes into a bucket. Holt was cleaning his revolver, the smell of gun oil sharp and metallic, mixing with the scent of the thawing earth. "I had a daughter," he said suddenly. He didn't look up from the gun, his thumb working a rag into the cylinder. "About your age." "Maybe a little younger." Lynn stopped peeling, the knife hovering over a strip of skin. She didn't turn to look at him, she knew that would stop the flow of words. She just waited. "Fever took her," he continued, his voice devoid of emotion, flattened by years of carrying the weight. "Down in Texas. A long time ago." He clicked the cylinder back into place and spun it. "Just thought you should know." Lynn resumed peeling, the scrape of the knife loud in the quiet. "I had a husband," she said, her voice soft. "He died on the ship coming over. They threw him into the sea." She dropped a peeled potato into the water with a splash. "I never saw where he landed." It was the most they had ever shared. 2 sentences that encompassed 2 lifetimes of grief. There were no tears, no embrace. Just the acknowledgement that they were both driftwood washed up on the same shore, battered by different storms. Holt nodded slowly, holstering the gun. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, tobacco. He rolled a cigarette with one hand, struck a match on his boot heel, and smoked, blowing the grey plume into the twilight. "Supper soon?" he asked. "Soon," she replied. And in that exchange, the ghosts of the past were acknowledged and then set aside, making room for the present. The road to the valley was finally clear of snow when the trouble arrived. It came in the form of 3 riders, men with dust on their coats and hard, calculating eyes. They weren't lawmen, and they weren't miners. They were scavengers, the kind of men who smelled weakness and isolation. Lynn saw them first from the garden where she was turning the soil. She dropped the spade and walked calmly to the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. Holt was in the barn. She was alone at the front. The riders slowed as they approached the cabin, their horses nervous, sensing the tension. The leader, a man with a scarred lip and a hat pulled low, grinned, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Afternoon, Missy," he drawled, looking her up and down with a predatory sneer. "Bit far out for a little thing like you, ain't it? Man of the house around." Lynn stood on the bottom step. She didn't shrink. She didn't look at her feet. She looked him in the eye. "He's around," she said, her voice steady. "What do you want?" The man laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "Just supplies, darling. Coffee. Whiskey. Maybe a warm bed." He swung his leg over the saddle horn, preparing to dismount. The other two men chuckled, shifting in their saddles. They saw a woman in a prairie dress. They saw a victim. They didn't see the winter that was forged in her spine. "We aren't a hotel," Lynn said, her hand drifting to the pocket of her apron. "Turn around." The leader's smile vanished. "Now, don't be unfriendly," he said, dropping to the ground. "We're coming in, whether you invite us or not." The blast of a shotgun tore through the air, sending a spray of dirt into the air inches from the leader's boots. He jumped back, his hand flashing to his gun belt, but he froze. Holt had stepped out of the barn shadows, the double-barreled shotgun leveled at the man's chest. But he wasn't alone. Lynn had drawn Holt's heavy revolver from her apron pocket, the one he had shown her how to use during the long winter evenings. She held it with two hands, the barrel heavy and wavering slightly, but her finger was tight on the trigger, and her eyes were absolute flint. She wasn't hiding behind Holt. She was flanking him. The leader looked from the dark muzzle of the shotgun to the woman with the hand cannon. He saw the way they stood, not as master and servant, but as a unit. A phalanx. He saw that there was no fear in them, only a lethal readiness to protect what was theirs. He slowly raised his hands. Just passing through, he muttered, the bravado evaporating like mist. "Didn't know the place was taken." Holt didn't lower the gun. "It's taken," he growled. Ride on. The men mounted up, casting nervous glances back at the Chinese woman in the beige dress who held the gun like she knew how to use it. They rode fast, kicking up mud, eager to be away from the valley. Lynn lowered the revolver, exhaling a breath she had been holding. Holt looked at her, a hint of a smile touching the corners of his eyes. "You aimed a little low," he noted. "I wasn't aiming for the chest," she replied dryly. "I was aiming for the kneecaps." Spring fully claimed the mountain in May. The valley exploded into color, wildflowers pushing through the grass, the stream rushing clear and cold over the stones. The world was alive again. The contract Holt had made in the general store was up. The snow was gone, the wagons would be running to the coast. Lynn could leave. She could take her wages. Holt had placed a heavy pouch of coins on the table that morning, and go find a life in a city where there were others like her, where the wind didn't try to kill you. She packed her bag, the same bundle she had arrived with, though now she had decent boots and a coat that fit. She walked to the wagon where Holt was hitching the team. He was going into town for supplies. He assumed she was coming to catch the stagecoach. He finished the hitch and turned to her. He looked older, the winter having carved deeper lines into his face, but he moved easier. He looked at the bag in her hand. "Stage leaves at noon," he said. It was an out. He was giving her the freedom to go without guilt. Lynn looked at the wagon, then back at the cabin. She saw the garden she had planted, the green shoots of peas and carrots just breaking the surface. She saw the porch where they sat in the evenings. She saw the mended fence. She looked at Holt, the man who had asked her the only question that mattered. She realized that the city offered noise, and crowds, and indifference. Here, there was wolves, and snow, and work. But there was also dignity. There was a place where she stood her ground. She walked past him to the wagon, but she didn't climb up to the bench. She tossed the bag into the back, amidst the empty grain sacks. Then she turned to him. "We need more seed," she said, her voice matter-of-fact. "The potatoes won't be enough for next winter. And we need new wool. The blankets are thin." Holt looked at her, his expression unmoving, but his eyes softening with a relief he would never voice. He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. "Seed," he repeated. "And wool." He climbed up to the bench and reached a hand down. She took it, her rough, calloused hand in his. He pulled her up. They sat side by side, looking out at the road, not as strangers, and not quite as family, but as partners in the long, hard business of living. "Let's go," she said. Holt flicked the reins. Higher the wagon rolled forward, the wheels creaking a familiar song, heading toward town, but carrying them both home. Sometimes, the place where you belong isn't where you were born, or where you're wanted. It's simply the place where you refuse to leave. And sometimes, love isn't a word. It's a fire lit in the dark, a mended coat, and a gun held steady in a shaking hand.